The rain fell in thin, cold threads over Willow Creek, draping the small Oklahoma town in a shroud of mist and melancholy. Streetlights flickered against the wet asphalt, their orange glow refracted by endless puddles collecting along cracked curbs. Houses hunched in silence, their windows dark, their porches sagging under the weight of neglect and December frost. The night seemed to breathe slowly, a steady rhythm of water dripping from rusted gutters and the distant hum of a freight train somewhere beyond the hills. Jack Thompson drove slowly through the main street, his patrol car moving like a lone sentinel through the storm. His shift had technically ended 2 hours earlier, but going home wasn't always easy. There were nights like this one when he needed to keep moving to let the town pass by in glimpses through the windshield to avoid the stillness of his own kitchen table and the hollow quiet of his thoughts. The wipers slapped back and forth in a monotonous beat. The heater blew a wet stream of warmth against his legs, but it did little to chase away the chill that lived deeper than the winter air. Jack had seen too much to feel entirely warm anymore. Years ago, he'd served with a federal task force out of Chicago, specializing in cases most people tried hard not to imagine: human trafficking, missing children, families shattered by neglect and violence. The worst of humanity had crossed his path, leaving scars that no uniform or badge could hide. He rarely spoke about those years. Not to Emily, his wife, not even to the chaplain who used to visit the precinct every Tuesday morning. The memories lived inside him like smoke trapped in a room long after the fire was gone. Sometimes on nights like this he could almost smell it again. He passed the small grocery store, its neon sign buzzing weakly, and the boarded-up diner that had closed the previous summer when the owner's health gave out. Willow Creek had always been a humble place, but lately it felt more fragile, like a body fighting to keep its heart beating. Poverty had crept into the corners, and with it came desperation, drug use, broken homes, quiet tragedies playing out behind closed doors. Jack turned onto a side street lined with run-down houses, the kind built quickly decades ago and never meant to last this long. He drove slowly, scanning the porches out of habit. That was when the radio crackled to life, sharp and sudden, cutting through the steady hiss of rain. Unit 12. The dispatcher's voice said, slightly distorted by static. Possible child disturbance, South Willow Street house number 43. Caller reports screaming for over an hour. No visual confirmation. Jack's hands froze on the steering wheel. Another voice acknowledged the call, a younger officer on duty tonight. Technically, Jack had no obligation to respond. His name wasn't on the assignment, and he was supposed to be heading home. He should have kept driving, but he didn't. There were certain calls a man couldn't ignore, no matter how tired he was or how many rules told him to step aside. Jack flicked on his turn signal, even though there were no other cars in sight, and steered south. The houses grew more dilapidated the farther he went. A few porch lights glimmered faintly, casting pale halos on warped wooden steps. Others were completely dark, their yards cluttered with rusted bicycles and trash cans permanently tipped on their sides. The storm seemed heavier here, the rain colder, the shadows deeper. Number 43 sat at the end of the block, a single-story structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The mailbox hung crookedly from one bent nail. There was no light, no sound, nothing to suggest life inside. Jack parked at the curb, cut the engine, and sat for a moment listening. Only the rain. No crying, no shouting, no footsteps. The kind of silence that made his skin crawl. He stepped out into the storm boots splashing in the shallow gutter water and approached the front door. He knocked once, then twice, his knuckles echoing against the wood. Silence. Something deep in his gut twisted. It wasn't instinct exactly. It was older than that, the kind of knowledge a man carries after years of seeing what people are capable of when no one is watching. He circled around to the back of the house, moving carefully. A narrow gap between two boards revealed a slice of the interior. Through it, Jack saw a flicker of movement. His pulse spiked. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, his voice low but urgent. Then he reached for the doorknob, half expecting resistance. It turned easily under his hand. Unlocked. The smell hit him first, a sour mix of mildew rot and something metallic. The air inside was unnaturally cold, as if the walls themselves were made of ice. Jack stepped carefully across the stained carpet, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Somewhere ahead, a faint whimper drifted through the stillness. The sound led him down a narrow hall to a closed bathroom door. He pushed it open, his breath catching as the beam of light swept across the scene. A child. A boy, maybe 8 years old, curled in a fetal position inside a bathtub filled with ice water. His skin was mottled and pale, his limbs bound with strips of duct tape. Purple bruises bloomed along his ribs and thin welts marked his arms. His eyes stared upward, wide and glassy, but utterly silent. For a heartbeat, Jack couldn't move. The world seemed to narrow to just that image, frozen in his mind like a photograph he would never be able to unsee. Then he lunged forward. The flashlight clattered to the floor. His hands worked furiously, tearing at the tape, whispering words he couldn't even hear over the rush of blood in his ears. Jack wrapped his own jacket tightly around the boy's trembling frame, lifting him from the freezing water. The boy didn't cry or resist. When the last strip of tape came free, his body simply went limp with exhaustion collapsing against Jack's chest. Jack carried him through the storm, shielding him from the rain as if protecting him from the entire world. By the time they reached the patrol car, Jack's heart pounded so hard it drowned out the thunder. He didn't wait for instructions or backup. He slammed the door, started the engine, and sped toward Willow Creek County Hospital. The drive was a blur of slick roads and flashing lights. One hand gripped the wheel, the other pressed firmly against the boy's back, feeling each shallow breath. At the hospital, nurses rushed to meet them. Bright lights and urgent voices swirled around as the boy was whisked onto a gurney. Warm blankets replaced the soaked jacket, IV lines were inserted, monitors beeped steadily. Jack stayed close, refusing to let go. When the initial chaos subsided, Jack found a chair beside the hospital bed. His own clothes were soaked through, but he didn't care. The boy's small hand curled around his finger, a fragile lifeline connecting two strangers in a storm-tossed night. As dawn crept through the narrow window, Jack made a silent promise this child would not be abandoned again. If this opening chapter has touched you, please consider subscribing to follow the rest of Ethan's journey. Stories of hope and resilience deserve to be heard, and your support helps bring them to life. Morning found the hospital quiet, all the night's alarms and hurried footsteps settling into a softer rhythm. The storm had thinned to a steady drizzle that brushed the windows like a whisper. Jack sat where he had spent most of the night beside the narrow bed, watching the fragile rise and fall beneath the blanket and the pale thread of an IV line that pulsed like a promise. The boy's name had been recorded on a chart, Ethan Ray. Names mattered. A name was a place to return to. The staff moved with the practiced calm of people who meet emergencies every day. A nurse adjusted a monitor and left a cup of water on the tray as if this were any other Tuesday. A doctor with kind eyes explained the plan in careful neutral phrases, never once using a word that would burn. Trauma had its own vocabulary, and she chose only the gentlest of it. Later, a social worker arrived, a folder hugged tight to her side. Sarah Mitchell introduced herself and sat across from Jack. Her voice was steady, the tone of someone who knew where the lines were and how to keep people from slipping over them. She spoke of procedures and timelines of temporary placement and safety assessments of what could be decided today and what would need time. Jack heard her, understood her, respected that she carried a portion of the responsibility he felt as a weight in his chest. But he also knew there are moments when a person needs more than a process. He told her he would bring Ethan home, that he would allow every inspection sign, every form open, every door, and meet every rule. The house was ready. His life was ready. Sarah's gaze softened without losing its clarity. She said she would come by soon. She said she had no intention of standing between a child and stability. The system could bend so long as it didn't break. By afternoon, the discharge papers were signed. The rain had lifted, leaving the world rinsed and colorless. Jack carried a small bag of hospital instructions and walked slowly beside the wheelchair. Ethan kept his eyes down the way some birds tuck their heads under a wing when they're frightened. In the car, silence settled again, neither empty nor hostile, more like a hallway between two rooms neither of them had ever entered before. Willow Creek looked different at that hour, less like a place and more like a series of spaces connected by breath. Jack drove the speed limit and used his turn signal even when no one was behind him. He narrated the town in his mind as if he were preparing a child for a first day at school. The old grocery that still sliced cheese by hand, the library with its faded mural of a rocket ship, the park where 100 pine cones lived and died. He did not say any of this out loud. He let the road do the talking. Home was a one-story with a porch big enough for 2 chairs and a dog that had never materialized. Emily had vacuumed twice, though the house was already clean, and set a lamp in the spare room with a shade that cast warm, forgiving light. On the bed, she had smoothed a soft blanket and placed a small stuffed fox near the pillow. She greeted everyone the same way, gently, and from the doorway because she understood thresholds. Caleb and Luke watched from the hallway with the alert stillness of boys who wanted to do right but weren't sure where right was. Caleb was 10 and already learning how to fold his feelings into the shape of responsibility. Luke was 8 and wore his heart where people could see it. They were kind children, but kindness requires practice, and this would be their lesson. Ethan entered the room and stood without touching anything, as if the floor might tip if he stepped too hard. Jack told him he could rest. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and stayed upright, hands in his lap, eyes tracking the doorway. His body learned the measurements of the space in seconds, the corners, the closet, the angle of the window lock. Emily moved in slow motion, setting a glass of water on the nightstand and retreating. In the hall, Caleb whispered a question to no one in particular. Luke reached for his brother's sleeve and missed. That first evening unfolded in quiet layers. The boys ate at the table because habit would be the first rope to hold them all together. Jack described the meal as if narrating a weather report. Emily passed a plate with the gentlest hands. Ethan took a bite of toast and held it like an assignment. When a spoon slipped and tapped the floor, his shoulders jumped. The house learned the cost of small sounds. After dinner, Jack walked down the hall and left bedroom doors slightly open. Light traveled like reassurance. They established a rhythm without announcing it. Morning meant a few bites of breakfast and a short drive to see the town in daylight. Afternoon meant a puzzle on the coffee table and a book open beside it, not because anyone would read it first, but because books domesticate silence. Evening meant lamps, never overhead lights, and a voice low enough to lay down on. Jack spoke sometimes about small things that didn't demand anything in return, how thunder moves across the plains, how pine cones close when it rains, how the dog he never adopted still felt like a promise. Ethan did not speak. He watched. He practiced being in a chair without leaning toward the wall. He tested the space between footsteps and learned the sound the refrigerator makes before it runs. He ate what he could. He slept when his body allowed, which at first was only in brief, drifting pockets. On the second day, Sarah Mitchell visited the house for the first time. Her shoes made no sound on the entryway rug. Her satchel clicked open like a clock. She checked outlets, and smoke detectors peered into the kitchen cabinets and wrote notes that were factual without being cold. She asked questions no one likes answering, and did it in a way that made the answers bearable. She observed the way Ethan tracked movement with his eyes and how Jack did not place a hand on his shoulder without letting the moment ask for it first. She commented on the natural light in the spare room and the reachable shelves. She noticed the small fox on the bed. When she left, she said she would return. Jack told her she was welcome, and he meant it. That night, the house breathed differently. The dishwasher hummed. The heater woke and slept. Caleb unrolled a sleeping bag and lay down beside his own bed as if proximity might count as participation. He wanted to be brave exactly the way adults praise, and the wanting itself tired him. Luke built a small fort of pillows and declared in a voice that no one else needed to hear that he was ready to be a brother. Emily moved like a steady compass from room to room, adjusting a blanket here, closing a window there. It was not so much caretaking as it was making the house fit the shape of new people. In the narrow hours when sounds collect, Ethan sat up in bed and stared at the half-lit doorway. Jack took a seat in the hall and read half a page of a book at a time, not meaning to be heard, just needing to be present. On the third day, a small moment tried to become a crisis and failed. Caleb knocked a glass on the table, and the sharp crack of it meeting the wood lifted Ethan from his chair as if a string had been pulled. He slid under the table with the spill and folded himself smaller than seemed possible. No one lunged. No one scolded the noise. Jack knelt not to retrieve him, but to place the house on pause. Emily fetched a towel as if spills were ordinary, because they are. Luke pressed his open hands to the floor and waited. Minutes passed like respectful guests. When Ethan crawled back to the chair, no one remarked on his return. The table received him exactly as it had before. That afternoon, Jack took Ethan for a drive past the park. Leaves clung to branches and dull browns, refusing to fall because letting go is a skill learned slowly. They parked and looked at the empty swings. It was the kind of place where children invent kingdoms. The boy watched the chains twist in the wind and said nothing. On the way home, he kept his gaze on the horizon line, the seam where land and sky agreed to meet. Progress arrived without spectacle. Ethan finished a piece of toast without setting it down. He stood at the back door and watched the rain without stepping away from it. He let the water run in the bathroom while he remained in the doorway, as if testing whether sound could be separated from fear. At bedtime, he moved the small fox closer to his pillow and left it there instead of holding it like a shield. By the end of the week, the house had rearranged its choreography. Doors closed gently, drawers made only soft sounds. Routines became rituals. Caleb began to understand that fairness and sameness are not identical. Luke discovered that patience is a way of making room. Emily found that she could prepare a meal without narrating every movement, because the quiet had learned to behave. Jack discovered there were more promises he could make than the one he had made in the hospital, and most of them involved being present for small things. One night, Ethan wandered into the kitchen when the house had thinned to whispers. Jack sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug that had long lost its heat. He did not startle. He did not speak. He allowed the space to open on its own. The boy sat across from him and looked at the spot on the table where his hands would rest if his body believed it. When the words came, they arrived as if they had been traveling a very long distance. Ethan announced not to the room, not to the man across from him, but perhaps to the air itself, that once he had been afraid of cold, and now he feared warmth. Warmth suggested attachment. Warmth asked a person to relax. Warmth could be taken away. The thought tired him in a way that sleep could not fix. Jack let the sentence stand as a small structure in the room, solid and unchallenged. He did not dismantle it with reassurance. He placed a napkin beside the cup as if preparing a place for the next sentence to sit. It did not come, and that was fine. The next day, Ethan fell asleep after dawn for the first time since he arrived. Sleep changed the architecture of his face. The lines of readiness softened, and the child he was beneath the readiness returned for long stretches. He woke to the smell of toast and the modest joy of a morning that had not demanded anything from him yet. Jack stood at the counter with a butter knife he did not use until the boy reached for the plate. The week closed with routine, the greatest luxury. It was not a parade of milestones, only ordinary hours strung together like beads that don't need to shine to be valuable. In all that ordinariness, the house kept becoming home. Jack read in the hall less often. Emily let the lamp in the spare room burn a little dimmer. Caleb asked a question that sounded like an invitation. Luke discovered that laughter can be quiet and still count. The moment arrived without rehearsal. Evening folded into night, and the family gathered in the living room where lamps cast their careful light. Emily sat with a mending basket. Caleb constructed a tower of blocks with Luke that leaned toward the possible. Jack rested on the end of the sofa, one leg tucked under the other, his hand open on the cushion as if setting down a tool. Ethan came and stood at the edge of the rug as if the thread that had led him thus far had stopped there to consider its next step. He sat not on the floor, not apart, but on the cushion beside the open hand. There are sentences that change the air of a house even before they are heard. This was one of them. Ethan asked with the smallest voice and the largest courage whether he might use a word for Jack that belongs to families who choose one another. He did not form a long question. He did not bargain for the right. He placed the request in the room and let it be weighed. Jack answered by not rushing. He allowed the weight of what had been asked to rest on him fully. Then he nodded, and the nod did not tremble. He told the boy that some words find their homes only after they have been carefully carried, and this one had arrived exactly where it was meant to be. The house made no sound at all, as if it understood a ceremony had occurred and wished not to disturb it. Ethan leaned not to hide, not to anchor, but simply to be nearer. The small fox slipped between them and found a new place to live. The room did not brighten, yet it felt lighter. In another part of the house a clock noted the hour, and then forgot it because time had become a different kind of measure. A family had taken shape tentative but real, like letters drawn in soft pencil before ink commits them to the page. Outside, the winter dusk pressed against the windows, and then, finding no purchase, settled back into the yard. Inside, warmth did what it always does when it is chosen, rather than assumed it made space for the next day to arrive. The fragile calm that had taken root in the Thompson house was like the first thin ice on a winter pond, beautiful, promising, but vulnerable to the smallest weight. Each day brought small victories, a quiet meal finished without tension. The soft thud of a ball passed gently between Luke and Ethan, a moment when Caleb sat near his new brother without needing to speak. These were pieces of ordinary life, and Jack treated them like rare treasures. He knew too well how quickly they could vanish. The letter arrived on a gray morning that seemed to hold its breath. Jack found it among a stack of bills and grocery coupons, its envelope plain, except for the return address scrawled in uneven handwriting. His fingers tightened before he even opened it, as if his body understood what his mind had not yet caught up to. The name, Melissa Ray, was written in shaky ink across the corner, and with it came the past Jack had been trying to keep outside their door. He read the letter alone in the kitchen. The words were raw and stripped bare, carrying no excuses, only confessions. Melissa spoke of addiction of anger that had consumed her like a fire left untended. She wrote about nights she couldn't remember and mornings she wished she couldn't. She admitted she had not been a mother, not really, not in the ways that mattered. She said she thought of Ethan every day, even when drugs and rage had made him a ghost in her memory. At the end, there was a revelation that struck like a blow. Ethan had a baby sister. Paisley, only a few months old, somewhere in the state's care. Melissa did not know where she was or who held her now, only that she existed and deserved more than the chaos she herself had given. If he ever asks about me, the letter said, "Tell him there was a time before the worst parts of me won. Tell him I once sang to him. Tell him he was loved even if I could not show it." Jack folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope, his hands steady only because they had to be. He knew these words would one day belong to Ethan, but he also knew now was not that day. The boy had just begun to breathe without fear. To burden him with this truth too soon would be to place weight on that fragile ice before it could hold. Later that afternoon, Sarah Mitchell arrived for her scheduled visit. She carried her usual leather satchel, the kind that looked like it had weathered decades of decisions. Her expression was kind but businesslike, her tone steady as she explained the latest development. The department had received a request from another foster family, one already approved and waiting for placement. According to procedure, Ethan might need to be transferred. The words landed in the living room like stones thrown into still water. Emily's hand froze on the edge of the table. Caleb looked sharply at his father, trying to read his face. Luke leaned closer to his mother, confused but sensing danger. Jack kept his voice even, though every muscle in his body tensed. He explained calmly but firmly that Ethan had been through too many transitions already. To move him again would be to undo every step of healing he had taken. Sarah nodded, understanding, but reminded him of the rules. The decision would not be hers alone. There would be a review, and a recommendation would be made. Jack said he would fight for the boy. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of an oath. Ethan stood at the doorway during this conversation, silent and watchful. He did not understand every word, but he understood tone, and tone had been his survival language for years. Something in it told him what he needed to know. This safety he had begun to trust could be taken away. That night, a storm returned. The rain was heavier than before, the wind sharp enough to make the windows rattle. Emily put Caleb and Luke to bed early, reading softly until their eyes closed. Jack checked the locks twice. The house seemed smaller somehow, its walls pressing inward as if bracing for impact. Sometime after midnight, Jack awoke to a sound he couldn't place. It was not the usual creak of settling wood or the soft hum of the refrigerator. It was the absence of something, a silence where there should have been breath. He rose quickly, moving down the hall. The door to Ethan's room stood open. The bed was empty. The blanket lay in a heap on the floor, the small fox abandoned beside it. Panic was an old companion, and it returned without mercy. Jack grabbed his coat and flashlight, calling softly at first, then louder when no answer came. Emily appeared in the doorway, fear etched on her face. Caleb and Luke stirred their eyes wide with questions they didn't dare ask. Jack told Emily to stay with the boys and ran into the storm. The rain blurred the world into streaks of silver and shadow. Jack's boots pounded the pavement as he searched street after street, shouting Ethan's name into the howling wind. Houses loomed like silent witnesses, their windows reflecting his flashlight back at him. He checked the park, the library steps, the old diner. Each place he found only emptiness and rain. Finally, near the edge of town, he spotted a small figure crouched beneath the twisted branches of a tree. Ethan's arms were wrapped tightly around his knees, his body shivering. Jack approached slowly, speaking low and steady the way one might approach a wounded animal. When he knelt beside him, Ethan flinched but did not run. His eyes were wide, his face streaked with rain and tears indistinguishable from one another. Jack didn't ask why he had run. He already knew. Instead, he draped his coat over the boy's shoulders and held him close. Ethan's words came haltingly torn from a place deeper than fear. He said he couldn't stay if staying meant losing again. He said he would rather leave first before anyone else could leave him. Jack's throat burned, but his voice remained steady. He told Ethan that home was not a thing that could vanish in the night. It was something they built together, one choice at a time. He promised he would not let go, not now, not ever. The promise wasn't perfect, but it was true. They returned home, soaked and exhausted. Emily met them at the door, relief and worry colliding in her expression. Caleb and Luke peeked from the hallway, their faces pale with questions they were too young to voice. Jack guided Ethan to his room, helped him change into dry clothes, and sat beside him until his breathing slowed. The boy did not sleep, but he no longer seemed ready to disappear. When the house finally settled, Jack sat alone in the kitchen. The letter from Melissa lay hidden in a drawer, its weight a constant presence. He understood now that ghosts did not always haunt through screams or shadows. Sometimes they arrived quietly in envelopes and legal forms and memories that refused to stay buried. The storm outside began to fade, leaving only the occasional drip from the eaves. Jack closed his eyes and breathed deeply, gathering strength for the battles ahead. The fight for Ethan's place in their home had only just begun, and he would need every ounce of resolve to face it. As you listen to this story, remember that Ethan's journey is far from over. If this chapter moved you, please subscribe and stay with us for the next steps of this difficult and hopeful path. Your support helps share stories of resilience and love that the world needs to hear. The week that followed was quiet, but it was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that stretches thin, trembling beneath its own weight, waiting for the smallest tremor to tear it apart. Everyone in the house moved carefully. Emily spoke softly. Caleb and Luke kept their questions to themselves, and Jack watched Ethan the way a man watches the horizon for signs of a coming storm. The visit from Sarah Mitchell came 2 days later. She stood in the doorway, her leather satchel clutched like a shield, and her expression carried news too heavy to soften. A baby girl had been found only 3 days old, discovered in a temporary care facility miles away. She was small, fragile, but stable. The state needed to place her immediately. There were no relatives listed, no other family to claim her. Jack knew before Sarah even said the name. Paisley, Ethan's sister. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the paperwork. Caleb and Luke leaned closer, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Ethan stood perfectly still, his body rigid with a tension that seemed to press inward rather than outward. Jack knelt beside him, speaking low, explaining what this meant: the baby would come here to this house to safety. Ethan did not answer. His eyes were wide but unreadable, like a deep lake with its surface perfectly still. That evening, Jack drove to the facility. The roads were long and empty, stretching under a sky the color of ash. He walked through a maze of narrow hallways and sterile rooms until he reached the small crib where a newborn lay swaddled in a pale blanket. She was impossibly tiny, her breath a whisper. Her fists curled in a stubborn defiance of a world too large for her. When he lifted her, her eyes opened briefly and her fingers wrapped instinctively around his thumb. In that moment, Jack understood that she too was part of this story, now a thread woven into the fabric of their fragile family. When he carried her through the front door of the house, the room seemed to hold its breath. Emily gasped softly and reached out, tears shining in her eyes. Caleb and Luke crowded close, their awe breaking through the hush. Ethan stayed back, pressed against the hallway wall. His chest rose and fell quickly, but he did not move forward. Jack crouched so the baby's face was level with his son's gaze. "This is your sister," he said gently. Ethan blinked, and for a long moment there was only the sound of Paisley's tiny breaths. Then, in a voice barely louder than the rustle of the blanket, Ethan said, "She doesn't know." Jack tilted his head. "Doesn't know what?" "She doesn't know what it's like to be left," Ethan whispered. His voice broke on the last word. Jack felt something twist deep inside him. He wanted to promise that Paisley would never know that pain, but promises like that were too big to fit into words. So he simply nodded and said, "She will never have to." Over the next few days, Ethan began hovering near the crib like a quiet guardian. He fetched diapers without being asked, watched as Emily prepared bottles, and stood beside the bassinet during feedings. He never called her by name, not at first, and he never called her sister. She was simply her, as though naming her might make the bond too fragile, too real. He sang to her sometimes, barely above a whisper, simple tunes that seemed to come from some hidden memory of gentler times. But as Paisley's presence grew, so too did the shadows Ethan carried. At night, Jack often found him awake, sitting in the hall outside her room. His shoulders were hunched, his gaze distant. Jack understood that this was more than protectiveness. It was a battle Ethan was fighting with ghosts no one else could see. One rainy afternoon, Ethan approached Jack with something clenched in his hand. It was the letter, the one Melissa had written weeks before. Jack's breath caught. The envelope was creased as though it had been read many times already. Ethan's voice was steady, though his hands trembled. "Is it from her?" he asked. Jack could not lie. He nodded. They sat at the kitchen table together while Ethan unfolded the paper. The boy read silently at first, his eyes scanning the words that carried both apology and pain. When he finished, he stared at the page for a long time before speaking. "She remembers me," he said finally, as if testing the shape of the words. "She says she loved me." "Do you think that's true?" Jack answered carefully, each syllable chosen like a stone placed on a fragile bridge. "I think there was a part of her that did, a part that got lost along the way." There was a long silence. Then Ethan looked up. "Can I see her?" Jack's heart clenched. He wanted to say no to shield the boy from more hurt, but he also knew that healing sometimes meant walking directly into the wound. After a moment, he said, "If you're sure we can go." The drive to the prison was silent. Rain streaked the windows, and the world outside seemed to blur into indistinct shapes. Ethan sat very still, his small hands folded in his lap. Jack wanted to reach for him but didn't. Some journeys must be made without a guiding hand. The facility was a stark building surrounded by chain-link fences and coils of barbed wire. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and weariness. They were led to a visitation room with thick plastic dividers and phones bolted to the walls. Before they entered, Jack knelt beside Ethan. "If you want to leave at any time," he said softly, "just stand up. I'll be right outside." Ethan nodded, once his face pale but determined. Jack watched through the narrow observation window as Melissa entered. She looked smaller than he had imagined, her shoulders hunched beneath the beige uniform. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face marked by exhaustion and regret. When she saw her son, she stopped as though struck. For a moment, neither moved. Then Melissa picked up the phone. Ethan did the same. Jack could not hear their words, but he saw the way Melissa's hands shook, the way Ethan sat perfectly still, his knuckles white around the receiver. Their conversation unfolded like a fragile dance. At one point, Melissa pressed her palm to the glass. Ethan did not mirror the gesture, but he didn't pull away either. Time passed differently in that room. When Ethan finally stood, Melissa did too. They did not hug, they did not touch. But something passed between them, a silent exchange that needed no witness. When Ethan emerged, his face was pale but calm. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Ethan nodded. "She said she was sorry. She didn't expect me to believe it, but she wanted to say it anyway. She told me she used to dream about us being a real family. She said the drugs took that away, and she let them." Jack waited, giving him space. "She asked if I hated her." Ethan continued. He looked up at his father. "I told her no. I don't know if I forgive her, but I don't want to carry it anymore. I'm tired." Jack's chest tightened, pride and sorrow mingling in equal measure. "You don't have to decide everything today," he said softly. "Forgiveness isn't a switch, it's a path." Ethan's shoulders eased slightly and he let out a slow breath. "But I think I can let go of some of it." They drove home in silence, the rain finally thinning to a mist. That night, Ethan sat beside Paisley's crib, rocking it gently while she slept. Emily stood in the doorway, watching as her son's small hands soothed his sister with a tenderness that defied everything he had endured. She turned to Jack and whispered, "He's different. He's lighter." Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion, like he set something down. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was the hush that comes when wounds begin to close, when ghosts lose their grip, and new life begins to take root. Ethan had faced his past, and in doing so he had carved a path toward a future where love was not just a word, but a home built one moment at a time. Winter lingered over Willow Creek, stretching the days into long shadows and nights that seemed to breathe with unease. Though the storm clouds had thinned, a new kind of tension had settled inside the Thompson home. It was not the sharp, panicked fear of those first nights with Ethan, nor the fragile, trembling quiet that came after Paisley arrived. This was different, heavier, older, the weight of a world that demanded decisions. Sarah Mitchell returned carrying more than her satchel this time. She brought updates, and updates meant choices. Derek Cole, Melissa's former boyfriend and the man responsible for so much of the pain Ethan had endured, had been located. He had been arrested after a botched drug deal on the far edge of the county. The arrest gave the state new leverage, new evidence, and with it a chance to bring justice to a boy who had been denied it for too long. But there was another consequence: the upcoming custody hearing. The state had to decide where Ethan and Paisley would live permanently. Forms had been filed, motions submitted, interviews scheduled. It was a process designed to be fair, but Jack knew processes could still fail. He had seen it happen too many times before. Emily listened carefully as Sarah explained each step, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Caleb and Luke were sent outside to play, their voices rising and falling in the yard like a distant tide. Ethan sat quietly in the corner, the baby nestled in a small bassinet nearby. He said nothing, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. He had learned to read adults the way some children learn to read books, carefully, line by line, searching for meaning between the words. Jack signed papers with a steady hand, though inside his resolve felt like glass under pressure. This was not just a legal battle. It was the culmination of every promise he had made to Ethan, every moment spent coaxing trust from a child who had every reason to doubt it. Losing now would mean more than separation. It would mean telling Ethan that safety was temporary, that love had limits. Jack refused to accept that. In the days leading up to the hearing, the house became a place of preparation. Emily gathered documents, photographs, and testimony. Sarah offered guidance, balancing professionalism with genuine care. Caleb and Luke sensed the gravity of what was coming and did their best to behave, though their confusion showed in small ways. Questions, half-asked games, abandoned mid-play. Ethan became quieter than usual, his movements deliberate, his gaze distant. He spent long hours beside Paisley's crib, humming softly, his small hand resting near hers. Sometimes he spoke to her in whispers no one else could hear. Jack suspected he was trying to promise her things he wasn't sure he could promise himself. The night before the hearing, Jack sat alone in the living room. The house was dark except for a single lamp. Emily found him there, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if it held answers. She sat beside him, placing her hand over his. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. Their silence was an agreement whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together. Dad. The courthouse was an old building with high ceilings and walls that seemed to absorb sound. The air smelled faintly of paper and nerves. Jack walked in, carrying Ethan's hand in his left and a folder of documents in his right. Emily followed close behind with Paisley nestled against her chest. Caleb and Luke stayed home with a neighbor, their absence a quiet reminder of what was at stake. Inside the courtroom, the benches were filled with strangers whose roles in this story were written in legal terms: guardian ad litem, caseworker, attorney. Across the aisle sat representatives from the foster system ready to argue procedure. Melissa was not there. Her choice had been made in another room on another day. She had signed the papers relinquishing her rights. It was her last gift to her children, the chance for a life she could not give them. The judge entered, a woman with a calm presence and eyes that seemed to weigh more than evidence. The proceedings began. Voices rose and fell like distant waves. Arguments were presented, timelines recounted, laws recited. Jack spoke when asked, his voice steady, his words plain. He told them about Ethan's first night, about the fear that lived in his eyes, about the slow, patient work of building trust. He told them about Paisley's arrival, about how Ethan stood beside her crib like a sentinel. He did not embellish. The truth was strong enough on its own. Sarah spoke, too, her testimony clear and compassionate. She described the home visits, the progress she had witnessed, the way the children had begun to heal. She spoke of routines and rituals, of small moments that added up to something unshakable. Her words painted a picture not just of safety, but of belonging. When the judge finally rendered her decision, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her voice was even, but there was warmth beneath it. The children would remain with the Thompsons, permanently. The paperwork would be finalized within the month. Ethan didn't react at first. He sat very still, as if waiting to be sure the words would not be taken back. Then, slowly, he turned toward Jack. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange was everything: relief, gratitude, disbelief, love. Jack reached out and Ethan climbed into his lap, pressing his face against his father's chest. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to cry, not in despair, but in release. The following weeks were a blur of preparations. Derek's trial began, bringing with it a different kind of closure. Jack attended only when necessary. He did not need to witness every detail. Knowing that Derek would face justice was enough. The man who had caused so much suffering would no longer cast a shadow over their lives. Back home, the focus was on building, not tearing down. The house filled with laughter again. Caleb and Luke returned to their usual noise and mischief, though now, it was tempered by a new awareness of how fragile happiness can be. Emily decorated Paisley's room with soft colors and gentle light. Ethan chose a small stuffed rabbit to place beside his sister's crib, a companion for her dreams. One evening, Jack found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with crayons scattered around him. The boy was drawing with intense concentration. When he finished, he handed the paper to Jack. It showed the family standing beneath a bright sun, Paisley cradled in Emily's arms, Caleb and Luke on either side, and Jack kneeling beside Ethan. Above them, in crooked but careful letters, was a single word: home. Jack framed the drawing and hung it in the hallway. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand before it and remember the bathtub, the storm, the trembling hand that had once clutched his finger. The journey between then and now felt impossible, and yet it had been made one step at a time. The story did not end with a single victory. Healing rarely does. There were still nightmares, still days when Ethan's past echoed through his present. There were moments when Paisley cried and could not be soothed, when Caleb and Luke argued, when exhaustion made everyone sharp and brittle. But there was also laughter. Shared meals, bedtime stories, and mornings where the sun rose on a house that was whole. On Thanksgiving, the family gathered around the table. Emily served food while Jack carved the turkey. Caleb and Luke took turns saying what they were thankful for. When it was Ethan's turn, he hesitated, then spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I'm thankful for my brothers, for Paisley, for this house, for the night someone came for me and didn't leave." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Jack reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. No one spoke for a long moment. They didn't need to. Gentil. As the chapter of their lives turned, Jack reflected on what it had taken to arrive here: courage, patience, and the simple, stubborn act of staying. Some rescues happen in a single moment, a dramatic rush through a storm, a child lifted from danger. But the truest rescues, the ones that last, unfold slowly. They are built in quiet choices, in the decision to show up day after day, to love without guarantee of return. If you have followed Ethan's journey, if you have felt even a fraction of what this family has endured and overcome, please subscribe and share this story. There are countless children like Ethan and Paisley waiting for someone to choose them to stay. Your support helps bring their voices to the world and reminds us all that even in the darkest places, hope can take root.